Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the channel. Today, we're going to go back to my bread and butter, which is Jonathan Edwards videos. Now, I have to admit that my Jonathan Edwards stuff does not always garner the most views. If that were the goal of this YouTube channel, to get people to watch as many times as I possibly could, then this would probably not be the best lane to choose. Some of the more controversial stuff obviously takes up that quadrant. But I want to have the best catalog of Jonathan Edwards related videos on the entire interwebs. And so to that extent, it is worth it for me to continue to press on putting good Jonathan Edwards stuff out there. Some of you already know that in addition to being the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA, I am also a devoted Jonathan Edwards scholar, and I've done a couple of books on Edwards, which I'd just like to recommend to you real quick. If you're interested in Edwards' resolutions, you might want to check this one out, Holy Living, Jonathan Edwards' 70 Resolutions for Living the Christian Life, or this one right here, my book, A Theology of Joy, Jonathan Edwards and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity. But we're not going to look at either of those topics today. What we're going to do is look at Jonathan Edwards on Romans 5. And so in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and share screen with you. And we're going to go ahead and talk about one of his most powerful sermons, which Jonathan Edwards preached at the close of the local revival at the end of 1735, actually summer of 1735. A wonderful sermon that is called Our Weakness, Christ's Strength. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is delve deeply into not only Edwards' treatment of Romans chapter 5 and somewhat Romans more broadly, but especially this particular sermon, which as I'm going to show you is a very powerful sermon that Edwards preached at a very poignant moment in the history of the local Northampton congregation. Now, what makes this sermon so interesting? Well, it's actually going to come at a very emotional moment for the Northampton church, and I'll tell you about that here in just a moment. But first, what I want to do is take a look at this little chart that I made for you about Edwards' published sermons versus his preached sermons on the book of Romans. So a couple of things that you can observe here is, first of all, Edwards did not preach expository sermons through the entire book of Romans, though that is the habit of the best expositors in my view and was popularized during the time of the Reformation. Edwards is a little bit more like Charles Spurgeon, where he doesn't preach through entire books of the Bible. Rather, he happens to hop around. So you can see he never treated Romans 15 or 16 and not much in Romans 10 either. So it looks like most of the Edwards related sermon production is right here in Romans 12, because he preached about 7 sermons on Romans 12. And these darker bars right here, these refer to his published sermons, which is distinguished from his preached sermons. Obviously, not every sermon that he preaches ends up getting published. But over here in Romans chapter 5, we notice sort of a confluence of the joining together of a lot of preached sermons plus published sermons, and this makes Romans 5 an interesting locus to look at. And not only that, but that's going to be the text of this particular sermon that we are going to dig into today. So if we look at Edwards' preaching on Romans chapter 5, what we realize is that he preached 5 sermons on this particular chapter. And again, of course, he did not do every verse because he wasn't an expository preacher through books of the Bible in that same fashion. And he has one on Romans 5, 7, and 8, which is undated. And then this one right here we're going to look at is on Romans 5, 6, much more on that one forthcoming. And then a few other sermons in the same chapter. So that's just kind of an interesting look at some of the statistical data here. We're going to go back to some more statistics in a little bit. But let's talk about the context of this particular sermon and why it is that I'm taking the time to make a video on this one particular sermon. What is it about his sermon on Romans 5, 6 that makes it so interesting? Well, a couple of things here. So first, we note the date, June of 1735. That is what we would call the end of the local revival. Now, just a little bit of context here about the Great Awakenings for those of you who maybe are forgetting or maybe didn't know in the first place, that the Great Awakening proper takes place in 1740 through 42. Now, some scholars would expand those dates and they'd start the Great Awakening back in 1734 and they'd push it all the way out to maybe 1746 at the latest. But really the concentration of the most sermonic energy, and as far as the revivals themselves go, it's really 40 to 42 when George Whitefield comes through the colonies that we can really pin a pin on the calendar of the Great Awakening here. But it was preceded by the local awakening in Jonathan Edwards' home church, the congregation at Northampton, where he is the preacher succeeding his grandfather Solomon Stoddard, who was the pastor there before Edwards was. Now, Solomon Stoddard had seen a number of harvests or revivals over his many years, 60 plus years as the pastor of that church. And this little local revival here, I shouldn't say little because it wasn't small, it was actually very significant. This is after the death of Solomon Stoddard. Edwards is full on as a senior pastor here, but this local revival in 1734-35 is something like the harbinger that's going to spark the haystack that's later going to come into full fire in the time of the Great Awakening proper, okay? But this sermon is different. This sermon takes on a very sad overtone. This is a very melancholic, powerful, but somewhat grievous sermon in that what happened is at the end of the local revival of that great year where Northampton is experiencing all of this joy, revival, salvations, people rededicating themselves to the Lord. Yet, unfortunately, nevertheless, it all comes to a crashing halt when Jonathan Edwards' own uncle, a man by the name of Joseph Hawley, committed suicide. And that moment brought a depression about on the local church that Edwards is going to try to respond to in this particular sermon. And scholars and historians mark the suicide of Joseph Hawley as the end of the local awakening, which is prior to the Great Awakening, and there will be a 5-year intermittent period between those two awakenings. Okay, so we can see why an event like this would cause an immediate halt, or at least a deferring to these awakenings, as a notable member of the congregation actually commits suicide. Now, why does he commit suicide? Well, scholars would mostly say that it was because of his own depression that he did not experience, Hawley didn't, the same kinds of joys and revival furor or zeal that most of the congregants had. And inasmuch as the Northampton congregation is now becoming somewhat famous across the Connecticut River Valley for its awakenings, Hawley finds himself very disappointed that he doesn't seem to be experiencing the same kind of awakening joys that the rest of the members of the church are. And so, unfortunately, he ends up committing suicide. And so Edwards is now going to preach a sermon in response to this. And we notice here that this is not a regular Lord's Day sermon, but rather this is a fast day sermon, indicating the fact that Edwards probably called a congregational day of mourning, and he's going to preach on another occasion besides just the Lord's Day. Although Hawley did commit suicide on a Sunday morning, now Edwards is going to respond to this. Okay, now thinking back to the Great Awakening and the local awakening for just a moment, the theme of justification by faith does loom large as it had at the time of the Reformation. In fact, Edwards had preached on Romans chapter 4, verse 5 on November of 1734, which is the marked beginning of that local revival. So it's interesting that justification by faith is the spark that basically bursts into the Reformation in the 1500s under Luther, and now is going to be used of God so as to bring about the Great Awakening here in the colonies in the mid-18th century. Now, another thing happened at the beginning of this time, the beginning of this revival, wherein, quite ironically, some other people died. In fact, 2 other young people from the congregation had died, a young man and a young married woman. And it's Edwards preaching their funeral sermons and preaching from Psalm 90, verses 5 and 6, that begins this quest for deeper meaning and significance. People are thinking about life, death, heaven, hell, eternity, salvation. And so, ironically, you have this preaching of Romans at the beginning and the end of the local revival, as well as you have a funeral sermon at the beginning and a funeral sermon at the end of the local revival. So we have sort of that irony here. Now, all of the local awakening, if you're interested, is going to be contained in Edwards' book, A Faithful Narrative, which is the Works of Jonathan Edwards, Volume 4. So if you want to read about the local awakening, that's the work that you're going to want to read. This is one that puts Jonathan Edwards on the map as far as his international reputation as a preacher and a revivalist. If you want to read about the Great Awakening proper, then probably what you're going to want to read is it's another long treatise called Some Thoughts on the Revival, in which Edwards is going to describe more of the colony-wide revival that they're going to experience in the 40s, especially attended by the preaching of William Tennant and George Whitefield. Okay? Now, this sermon that we're looking at today is interesting, and I think it's a rather important sermon because Edwards is going to do a couple of things that are slightly unusual as far as his preaching style goes. For one thing, Edwards is going to preach with the plural first person we and us much more often in this sermon than he commonly does. Edwards will usually talk in the third person because he's usually talking about theoretical doctrines, and he's quite the doctrinal preacher for the most part. So Edwards will often talk about God and Christ and Israel and so forth. But here in this particular sermon, Edwards is going to get very, very personal, and he's going to use a lot of we and us language. Now, not surprising to us is that Edwards is going to preach from just one verse of the Bible. This is something that Edwards very often does. He's going to preach here on Romans 5:6. And interestingly, this is going to be one of those sermons that Edwards is pleased to re-preach multiple times, which I find slightly curious, given that its construction in its original writing was given at such an interesting, particular, and poignant emotional moment for the Northampton congregation. That notwithstanding, we know that he did that because in Edwards's manuscripts, he will quite often make notes or little tic-tac marks on the top of his manuscripts indicating the fact that he's going to preach that sermon and had preached that sermon a number of different times. Now, as Edwards is going to have to redress the congregation because of the sadness of Joseph Hawley's death, he's going to somewhat talk around this. This is the event, of course, that everybody's thinking about, and Edwards has called a fast day, and now he's going to preach a sermon. But Edwards doesn't speak explicitly about Hawley's death until the penultimate paragraph of this particular sermon. So he is going to refer to it, but not necessarily in so many words. So Edwards is speaking to the mood, but he's not necessarily going to name names in particular. That would be way too painful and certainly inappropriate for this kind of a sermon. Now let's talk a little bit about the typical Puritan sermon, because this one is going to follow that general format. And I do have some other videos on Puritan style preaching as well as Puritan applications and so forth. So if you've seen those videos, then you may already know this. But I want to go over this for the sake of the neophyte who's not aware of how a Puritan sermon works. So let's look at the typical construction of how a sermon holds together. Typical Puritan sermons had three parts, and it's fairly predictable, and almost every single one of Edwards' sermons are going to work like this. They're going to start off with a text in which the preacher describes the context and the themes of the passage that they're looking at. There's going to be a longer section called the doctrine, wherein usually in one punctiliar statement, the author is going to name a particular doctrine that he's going to preach, but then he may rather elaborately number a lot of subheadings or corollaries in that doctrinal articulation. And then finally, every sermon is going to have a long section of application. And these applications are fairly predictable as well. It doesn't mean they're exactly the same in every sermon, but the basic kinds of applications are going to be similar. Usually what you're going to have is your applications of instruction, which means this is what I want to teach you. I want you to know this. You're going to have some kind of a rebuke where the pastor calls his congregation to repentance. You're going to have an exhortation wherein the pastor is telling the people, now therefore go out and do this. There's going to be some kind of consolation to the heart of the hearer so that they can rest and trust in the gospel. And then very often there will be an examination in which the person is supposed to look inside themselves and try to discover by God's help what is truly in their hearts. And true to form, Edwards is going to do that in this particular sermon, no question about that. Now, I thought about something rather interesting as I was looking at the sermon. I noticed that the application section was absolutely huge in this particular sermon. So looking at it, it's quite large. It's something like, what is this? About 61% of the sermon is an application. Now, a lot of pastors today, they sort of struggle with application and they're not sure how to even apply the text. But Edwards has 61% of this entire sermon being application, meaning that 32% is doctrine. And then we have just a small little slice of pie right here, which is the text where he describes the literary context of this particular passage. Now, I thought that was interesting. So one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to compare this to another Edwardsian sermon just to see how it would stand up in relation to other sermons that Edwards has preached. So which sermon do you think I picked? Well, obviously I picked Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God because that's kind of his most famous sermon, and it's a revival sermon too. So I was interested to see exactly how that would look. So I went ahead and I charted this one out too. And look at this. This is almost incredible. You'd think that I just copied the same chart twice. First, I actually thought I made that mistake. Look, 61% application, 32% doctrine, 7%, 6% text. That's almost exactly what we just saw. Let's go back even to this one. Look at that. The chart hardly even moves. I thought there's no way that can be right, but it is right. I checked my numbers twice, and I picked another sermon by which to compare it. And so I looked at true saints absent from the body or present with the Lord. And here I kind of breathed the sigh of relief that it is somewhat coincidental, this overlap between Christ's strength and the sermon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, because here the application is down to only 35%, the doctrine is up to 60%, and the text is at 5%. So basically the doctrine and the application somewhat switched places in this sermon. Why do I bring this up? Well, the reason I bring this up is just to remind regular preachers today, if you happen to be a preacher or a pastor, how important it is to apply the text. We often think in terms of doctrinal categories, and for those of us who like expository sermons, we certainly want to get into the grammar of the text and talk about verb tenses and meanings of words and do word studies and things like that. But honestly, the Puritans didn't do a lot of that. And one of the reasons why they didn't is because they assumed a high level of biblical literacy from their congregations. And so they didn't have to explain the minutiae that we do have to explain to our congregations today. So if I was going to make a pie chart of my own preaching, I would probably spend more time, I certainly would, in, for instance, the text section than I might otherwise do. But, whoops, we're going the wrong way here. Whoops, now we're really going the wrong way. Sorry about that, everybody. But I labor to stress this point because I do think it's important that pastors learn how to apply their sermons. And here, there's probably something that we can almost mimic or imitate from Puritan sermons that are going to pay us some dividends in the long run. Okay? Now, let's go on to our particular sermon here, and let's look at the text. So the text is Romans 5:6. For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. So Edwards, thinking about his congregation and the pain that they're experiencing, the loss that they're experiencing with the suicide of Joseph Hawley, Edwards wants this text to be the word to bring comfort to his people. Again, for when we were yet without strength, okay, so here's a moment of sadness and difficulty and trial for the congregation. In due time, Christ died for the ungodly. So an obvious word of consolation so as to encourage then his church. Now, in the text section, again, which Edwards spends only 6% of the sermon on, he's going to remind his church of some very basic principles that are right there intrinsic to Romans chapter 5. The doctrine of justification by faith alone, the fact that Christ's death brings us peace with God, moreover, even purpose in suffering, because suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, hope, and hope does not disappoint us, etc. And so then the wonderful love of Christ is going to be brought into focus here with a text like this. Now, as Edwards begins to articulate his doctrine, here is how he's going to formulate his doctrinal statement. Remember, every Puritan sermon had one of these. For we are in ourselves utterly without help in any strength or power to help ourselves. Now, what Edwards is going to do, of course, is he's going to buttress this doctrinal statement with a lot of sub-thoughts here. He's going to itemize why it's true that we're utterly without strength in ourselves. And therefore, of course, Edwards is going to push us towards an encouraging word of Christ's strength as he turns towards the later portions of the sermon and especially in the application sections. So what Edwards does here is he describes our utter weakness before the Lord in no uncertain terms. Edwards, even though you'd think, man, the people really need a word of comfort here, right? But Edwards is a Puritan. He's a Calvinist. He's going to press hard into the depravity of man and even articulate 6 or 7 reasons why we're unable to do anything good. We are unable to purchase God's favor. In other words, we cannot barter or trade anything that we have for God. We cannot procure his blessing. We can't save ourselves from evil. We can't erase our own guilt, and we certainly can't escape God's wrath. Okay, so Edwards does not let the congregation off easy, even though this is a fast day and a very mournful sermon that Edwards is going to preach here. And the reasons why Edwards says that we are so weak and so laden with debility in our human nature is because we're creatures. So Edwards is going to bring up the creator-creation distinction here in the sermon. that we've lost our ability in the fall. Remember, Edwards has the doctrine of moral inability. We have natural ability, but moral inability in order to do anything righteous before the Lord. We're spiritually dead. We're in a state of slavery. And then, rather painfully, Edwards is going to use a really graphic image of an infant that's been exposed in a field. Now, I don't want to get into this too darkly, but I do want to just remind you that in the ancient world, if a mother and father did not want to keep their child, they practiced the barbaric practice of infant exposure, which is to say that they left them out in a field to be killed by the wild elements of nature or the animals or heat or cold or weather or what have you. So Edwards suggests that in our natural condition, prior to our conversion and without Christ in the world, we are very much like infants who are exposed to the outward elements of the world, and we would certainly die if we did not have a help and a Savior. And so that being the doctrine of this sermon, then, Edwards is next going to do his application. And again, in this sermon, it's a large application section, larger than one might think. Here, though, he's going to start off with instruction. Number one, hence we may learn, remember instruction is an application of learning, what a proud creature man is that is so prone to self-dependence and so to conceit of strength that he seldom looks to God for help. Okay. Now, implied here is what he really wants us to do by way of exhortation. Look to God for help. But we need to learn, Edwards says first, how dependent we are so that we would then turn to God for the help that we need. Now, in his second use, he is going to exhort. So the first one was instruction. The second one is exhortation. And here he's going to exhort us to do what? Not to depend on ourselves, but on God. And why would we do that? Well, especially when we're in difficulties or temptations. And because of this, it's our blindness, our hardness of heart. It's the power of our satanic enemy, and even our propensity to be somewhat mischievous and wily and unkempt and unrestrainable that we have to especially look to God in these sort of dark and difficult times. Now, here, Edwards is going to swing to the positive. If you thought that the sermon was overly negative, it is certainly not. Remember, the title of the sermon is Our Weakness, Christ's Strength. And this is where Edwards is really going to begin to drive home this idea that God is able to help. Now, here is a word that would cause his congregation to breathe hope again into their lungs. God is greater than Satan, and certainly Edwards would think that Satan was active and malevolent in these things. You know, it's interesting. Edwards has a very spiritual view of reality in history, in his own time, whether it was Indian raids or whether it was the weather or whether it was the crops failing or whether it was threats from Roman Catholic France. Edwards always interpreted reality as a spiritual war that is unfolding in real time. It's not as though God and Satan are equals going at each other. Certainly God is God and Satan is just a wicked spirit. It's not like a yin and a yang where one is good and the other is evil, but they're essentially coterminous powers within one another, beside one another. No, God is clearly God and Satan is weak and small, definitely. But Edwards does see reality as a spiritual war, and the Christian is like a pilgrim in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, wherein he has to endure through many hardships and afflictions of Satan. But that being said, Christ is a sufficient mediator. And here Edwards is going to do something very pastoral and pointing his congregation towards the helpful mercies and love of a benevolent and kind Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Then, somewhat surprisingly, he has a second exhortation. Usually he might switch to another form of application, such as self-examination or comfort or consolation or something like that. But here he has a second exhortation, and this one is, let us ascribe all glory of the promoting of religion amongst us to God alone. Now here we get a sense of what Edwards thinks might be the problem. Again, he's going to interpret all events in the scope of this unfolding redemption history that he sees. And Edwards believes that probably the reason that God has cut the Northampton congregation down so low in this moment is that they are beginning to swell with pride even as their congregation is experiencing these revival fires and others are not yet. In fact, the idea that Edwards writes a faithful narrative and the Northampton congregation becomes somewhat famous, not only in the colonies, but also in Europe, that only puts more pressure on the congregation to feel this kind of pride. And so Edwards believes that an event like this is probably God's cutting them down at the knees so as to remind them again that only God should get the glory when revival begins to take place. And so Edwards is going to conclude the sermon with a flurry of questions. And here, finally, we're going to hear a somewhat overt, but still a very subtle reference to Hawley's suicide as he asks the congregation these questions. Have we, in fact, credited ourselves with this revival? Have we been boasting in our own strength and our own religiosity? Have we truly examined ourselves so as to see that it's really justification by grace through faith and not something that we ourselves are doing? And then finally, is it possible that God has rebuked us in this way by one of our leading men committing suicide at such a time as this? So in the final thrust of the sermon, in the last paragraph or so, Edwards will remind his people that God is jealous of his own glory, that we ought to therefore then humble ourselves and walk humbly among men. And so that is Edwards' sermon, Our Weakness, Christ's Strength. Again, it comes at a very poignant time in the history of Northampton, a very sad and somewhat dolorous time for this particular congregation. And yet, don't forget that just 5 years hence, God is once again going to blow the revival fires, not only from Northampton, but to many, many churches around it. And indeed, all of the colonies are going to catch on fire with this great revival zeal for the glory of God and his Son, Jesus Christ. All right, well, that's all I've got for you today. Don't forget, real quick, if you're interested in Edwards stuff, check out my book, Holy Living, Jonathan Edwards' 70 Resolutions, which he wrote when he was just a young man, or this book right here, A Theology of Joy, Jonathan Edwards, and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity. Thanks so much for checking in. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.